So on yours, it's regarding a tenant deposit. And in this particular instance, it seems like it's a very old lease agreement. The original landlord seems to have passed away. Then there was an estate that was holding the tenant's deposit. And then I believe, if I understand correctly, then there was some kind of heir that possibly then or at some stage became the landlord. And now this person has sold the property and the purchaser, and now there's a new purchaser that's becoming the landlord, right? So you can already discuss maybe the legal implications over how landlords stay land or how purchasers become landlords in our law. But the question here is more specifically around the deposit, where it should go in the placement of the deposit, and then most importantly, the calculation of interest. If the deposit was being held in the estate account, but not necessarily in an interest-bearing account, what are the consequences?
Perfect. So we're touching on a couple of different areas of law here that we just need to clarify. The first is the principle of Huur, Gaat, Voor, Koop, which we've done in detail on this particular channel, but just for the purposes of this particular question, the principle of Huur, Gaat, Voor, Koop provides that where a property which is subject to a lease agreement passes on to a new owner, okay, that new owner is subject to the terms and conditions of that lease agreement. So in other words, they have the obligations in terms of that lease, so they must continue to provide the tenant with undisturbed use and enjoyment of the property, but they are also provided with the rights of that particular lease agreement. In other words, they are entitled to the remuneration, the rental payable in terms of that. And that passes through operation of law. So there's no agreement necessary. It just happens by law. Okay. So when this occurs generally and a new person takes over a lease agreement, if there is a deposit which is held by the previous landlord, what they ought to do in law is pay that deposit, including any interest which is accrued on that deposit, over to the new landlord in the circumstances. Remember, that deposit which is held by the landlord, okay, is not their money. It is the tenant's money, which is held in a secure state by the landlord in security of any obligations that the tenant might have. So that money must get passed over in full, okay, from the selling landlord to the new landlord in the circumstances. So that's our principle of Huur, Gaat, Voor, Koop. And just in terms of interest, we obviously know that in terms of the Rental Housing Act, there's a provision in the Act that says if the landlord is holds a deposit in terms of a lease agreement, they don't have to, but if they do, that deposit must be invested with a financial institution in South Africa and must be invested in an interest-bearing account, savings in terms of the Act. Okay, so now we have a question. Okay, there is the elements of an estate, and the deposit was paid into the estate account where it wasn't accruing interest, and has now been paid out to whoever the beneficiary in terms of this estate is. Okay, and so because interest hasn't now accrued on the deposit, they're asking, how do we figure out what this interest portion is? Okay, now this is going to depend obviously on when exactly the deposit was paid, at what point before death, during death, or whatever the case is. However, if you are in a circumstance, as I say, that the legislation is quite clear on the fact that if a deposit is taken at any point, it needs to be invested in an interest-bearing account, and it needs to accrue interest to the benefit of the tenant. So if you do have a circumstance like this, where perhaps a deposit was taken, it was invested somewhere for whatever reason, and it wasn't incurring interest during that period, if you are now the landlord who ultimately takes the ownership of that property, and now you have obligations to that tenant, unfortunately, the obligation sits on you to make sure that when you pay back the deposit, interest has accrued on that particular deposit. So my suggestion in a particular circumstance like this is there's going to have to be a calculation ultimately to figure out what interest has accrued. So best practice is obviously, if you have your tenant and they pay you a deposit, make sure you open up a savings account, put it with a registered financial institution, put it in there. You don't have to ask any questions. But if for whatever reason you're in a circumstance like our writer today and that hasn't happened, it's time to do a little bit of math. Okay, trying to find out the savings rate on a savings account with a registered financial institution should not be a difficult task. Your bank will have exactly what interest is accruing on their savings account, and then you can go back and do the calculation on what exactly the interest accrued on this particular deposit ought to have been in the circumstances. And unfortunately, I think as the landlord who then takes over the particular deposit and the lease agreement, in particular in circumstances where there's an estate late, which is the case in this particular question, you are going to be ultimately the one who has to perform in terms of the legislation and in terms of the lease agreement, and pay back the deposit as well as the interest accrued. So hopefully that's not a substantive amount. I mean, our normal savings accounts hover around 2-3%, and if we're talking about a deposit of 10,000 rand, these are not huge amounts that are going to bankrupt anyone. But I'd be very careful as the landlord who ultimately becomes the owner from the estate of the property, because as I say, by virtue of the principle of Gaat, Voor, Koop, you are liable for the obligations in terms of that lease agreement, and that absolutely means that you are liable for whatever the interest portion of that deposit is now that you are the owner of the property. So please make sure that you comply with the act in that regard. Do a calculation if you haven't, and best practice for anyone who's out there, make sure that you keep your deposit in an interest-bearing account, savings account with a financial institution, so you don't have to worry about these things.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Perfect. Thank you, Bruno, and we will see you again next week.
Awesome. Cheers, man.
Bye.